Welcome to Native American history. Today we return to the spring of 1832 on the Rock River. One band came back to old cornfields, and the Midwest changed course. In your view, what truly lit the fuse? The 1804 paper dispute, or fear spreading faster than facts? Where are you watching from, and have you visited Wisconsin Heights or Bad Axe? In the spring of 1832, a Sauk war leader crossed back over the Mississippi with family's elders and a small fighting corps. He believed the planting grounds along the Rock River still carried his people's rights. Settlers believed the ground had passed to the United States by treaty. That disagreement set the frontier alight. April 1832, Rock River Country, Illinois, and the Michigan Territory. The principal actors are the Thakiwaki Sauk and the Meskwaki Fox, under the leader known as Black Hawk, with parties of Kickapoo and Potawatomi allies. Arrayed against them are Illinois militia and United States regulars under Brigadier General Henry Atkinson, with Colonel Zachary Taylor and Colonel Henry Dodge with Ho-Chunk scouts. The guiding question is simple. What led a small returning band to trigger a regional war, and why did the way it unfolded serve as a warning for the Midwest? The answer lies in disputed paper from 1804 hungry Springfields, an unready militia system, and a pursuit that ended in a killing ground on the Mississippi. Time, place, and actors are fixed, so the stakes are clear. The villages at Sauk near Rock Island had long served as seasonal homes for planting and harvest. Surveys and petitions pressed eastward after the War of 1812. By 1831, militia had forced a withdrawal across the river. Black Hawk returned with hope to plant Sikh provisions and ask counsel among neighbors upriver. Rumor outran couriers. A white flag would be misread. A single shot could empty a saddle and then a town. This film follows that chain from return to rout, from parley to pursuit. It holds to the words of officers' reports and native accounts. It traces how fields and ferries, trails and bluffs turned choices by a few hundred people into policy for a region. It asks the viewer to weigh what happened at the river against what was written on paper years before. The deep cause begins in 1804 at St. Louis. United States officials met a small delegation of Sauk and Meskwaki headmen. The paper they signed ceded a wide tract east of the Mississippi. Many families in the villages did not accept that the men who signed held full authority to give up planting grounds. For years after the War of 1812, the arrangement lived in tension. The people returned each spring to Sauk near Rock Island to plant corn, then crossed west for winter hunts. Officials treated the return as a privilege under sufferance. The people treated it as a right, never surrendered. Pressure on the ground grew after 1815. Survey chains cut lines across prairie and oak openings. Ferries multiplied. The lead district around Galena drew miners and freight wagons. Petitions from settlers reached the Illinois governor and the Indian Agency at Rock Island. Agency clerks recorded complaints about fences broken by returning parties and fields claimed without fee. Traders extended credit, then pressed for payment in pelts from hunts west of the river. Each season the margin narrowed. Policy moved as well. Indian affairs sat within the War Department. The Army held forts along the river. The Indian Office managed annuities and trade. Both offices pushed one end. Fix the line on the west bank for the Sauk and Meskwaki. Fix settler titles on the east. The stated logic was order and peace. The effect was to close the old circle of planting and hunting. Within Sauk leadership, two lines emerged. Keokuk argued to avoid open war. He read numbers and powder stores and judged the odds poor. Black Hawk believed that return to the old fields with neighbors near Prophetstown could be made with counsel and with aid from traders to the north. He had fought with British allies in the recent war, and some Americans later used that tie to mark his band. They called it the British Band, though no British officer marched in 1832. The proximate cause is the cycle of 1831. In that spring, the people returned to Sauk. Illinois militia assembled under orders by Governor John Reynolds. General Edmund Gaines demanded removal. Faced with force and short supplies, many families crossed west. Black Hawk went as well, yet he did not consent in mind. The move came under threat, not agreement. Winter passed with hunger. Reports from the Rock Island Agency noted that the old fields on the east lay ready for corn, if only hands could plant them. Spring 1832 opened with high water and thin larders. Black Hawk gathered families and a small fighting corps. The objective was narrow: cross at the lower river, move to the Prophet village on the Rock River, plant if permitted, seek provisions, ask counsel from Ho-Chunk and Potawatomi neighbors. He carried hopes that northern traders or distant British posts might supply powder if talks failed. Constraints were severe. Many elders and children traveled. Pack animals were few. Ammunition was short. Flooded creeks slowed every mile. United States objectives were clear on paper: prevent reoccupation east of the Mississippi, protect settlements, enforce the 1804 paper as binding title. General Henry Atkinson organized a column of regulars at Fort Armstrong with aid from Colonel Zachary Taylor and Colonel Henry Dodge. Governor Reynolds called up volunteers for short enlistments. Constraints were real. Militia discipline was uneven. Units mustered out as others came in. Supplies moved by steamboat and wagon against rain and mud. Coordination across columns depended on couriers and on chance meetings at fords. Signals failed early. Messages sent upriver to warn Prophetstown to send Black Hawk back arrived late. Rumor ran ahead of riders. Some settlers abandoned cabins without seeing an enemy. Others rode to join musters without rations or proper cartridges. A few local leaders talked of a great alliance forming. In truth, the returning band was small and hungry. The overlap between Sauk fighters and allied raiders was fluid. The line between a plea for food and a threat could shift with the wind. Logistics for Black Hawk were measured in handfuls: corn for seed, a little dried meat, old flintlocks, and a few better guns. The Corps fighters knew the river bends and the oak ridges. They could move fast if unburdened. They were not unburdened. Logistics for the United States were measured in manifests and quartermaster notes: pork barrels, hard bread, powder in kegs. Yet every wagon needed a team, and every team needed forage that spring rains soaked and spoiled. By late April, the band was up the Rock River. American officers debated whether to wait for regulars or to push with mounted volunteers. The choice would matter. A forward detachment could arrive first with no interpreter and no fixed rule for flags or parleys. A regular column would move slower, but might keep order at first contact. The system could not hold steady. Volunteers rode ahead. A negotiation attempt met fear. A shot cracked. The buildup was over. The campaign began. May 1832 opened with rain on prairie grass and creeks running brown and high. The main militia concentration formed at Dixon on the Rock River, where mounted companies arrived in uneven waves. General Atkinson labored to bring regulars up by steamboat and wagon against the current and the mud. Between those two movements lay a gap in time and discipline. That gap produced the first break in order. On May 14, a detachment under Major Isaiah Stillman pushed ahead from the Dixon line toward the upper branches of the Kishwaukee. The men were volunteers on short enlistments. Some had never served under fire. They moved fast without stable rations or a fixed interpreter team. Near a small stream later called Stillman Creek, they met a party of Sauk riders carrying a white flag. The Sauk sought to parley for time, while families and baggage moved north. Accounts diverge on who fired first. What does not diverge is what followed. Several shots cracked from the volunteer line. The Sauk messengers wheeled and fled. A small Sauk fighting party struck back to cover the withdrawal. The volunteer formation dissolved. Horses bolted. Men scattered over the low banks and oak openings and did not reform until miles away. The fight was brief. The panic was long. In the hours that followed, couriers spurred from farm to farm and from camp to command post. News outran detail. By the time messengers reached Dixon, The incident had grown in the telling. Reports spoke of a great force and a night assault on the camp. General Atkinson ordered care and concentration. Governor Reynolds called out more men. The episode entered militia memory as Stillmans Run. It also entered the Sauk calculus as proof that the return had become war. Black Hawk turned his marching plan from planting to evasion. He aimed to draw pursuers away from the slowest families and to find food along the way. The days after Stillmans Run saw settlements empty toward blockhouses. At Apple River, a small trading post strengthened palisades and posted sentries day and night. At Galena, townspeople packed wagons and examined the scant powder in store. At Dixon, officers debated next moves while supply boats labored upstream against driftwood and snags. The river itself became a courier. Messages traveled by sternwheel and by horseback. Each day lost by the regulars brought another muster of volunteers with no common drill. On May 21, at a mill on Indian Creek, near present-day LaSalle County, a party of raiders attacked settler families, killing men, women, and children. Survivors later described a swift strike and a withdrawal into the timber. The number of attackers was small. The effect was large. Many Americans read the raid as proof of a wider conspiracy and as direct coordination with Black Hawk. Later research and some native testimonies point to a local Potawatomi group acting in anger over land and previous grievances. The line of command from the Sauk Band to Indian Creek remains contested. What is not contested is the emotional result. Militia numbers rose, restraint fell. In early June, Black Hawk's moving village threaded north and east between waterways. Food grew short. Hunters ranged far for deer and small game with mixed success as spring turned to early summer. The band drew near the old Prophet Village site on the Rock River and then slipped north toward safer ground. Scouts from the Ho-Chunk Nation watched the trails and reported to both sides at different times. Many Ho-Chunk families tried to avoid entanglement, while a smaller number acted as guides to American officers. The landscape pressed its own logic. Wet meadows slowed baggage animals. Ridges of oak and hickory offered brief concealment. Creeks could be forded at dawn when water ran lowest, or at dusk when light failed a pursuer's eye. A single voice from the native side conveys the sense of compression after the first rout. "We sent a flag to talk," they fired. "We must now move to save our people, we are few, and have old ones with us if we can draw them from the village. We may yet cross the great river." Black Hawk, autobiography, Near Rock River Country, 33. That sentence sits inside a larger dictated narrative set down a year later. It frames the move not as a march on towns, but as a shield for a migrating camp. American officers on the ground did not read it that way at the time. Their letters speak of an enemy band maneuvering for advantage. Those parallel readings passed one another like boats at night. By mid-June, the pressure spread to the lead mining region. On June 14, a mixed Sauk and Allied party probed the Apple River Fort near present-day Elizabeth. Inside the stockade stood a small community of men and women hastily organized to defend their families. The attackers tested the walls with small arms fire and tried to draw defenders into the open. After a brief exchange, the native party broke contact and faded into the timber. Casualties on both sides were limited. The meaning exceeded the numbers. To the defenders, the fort had held, and the community had shown resolve. To American commanders, the incident confirmed that the enemy could appear anywhere along the frontier line. In the same week, Henry Dodge led mounted men in short strikes against small groups thought to be scouts or foragers from the Sauk Band. These contacts rarely rose to full battle. They did tighten the circle. Each report of a skirmish fed the belief that a decisive encounter was near, if only the columns could converge and the supply could sustain them in the field. Atkinson's regulars pressed from the south and east, while volunteers ranged from Galena and from the mining settlements. The plan coalesced around finding the main trail and pushing it across the watershed toward the Wisconsin River. Messenger speed and interpreter availability shaped the tempo. A single day's delay in translating a message at a village could misalign 2 columns by 30 miles. An unshod horse could reduce a courier's pace from 70 miles in 2 days to 30. News of the Indian Creek killings traveled fast because settlers carried it with fear in their voices. Messages from native headmen traveled slow because they had to pass through an agent or a trader who might be absent or unwilling. Weather added a steady drag. Rain softened banks and turned ford approaches to mire. Wagons sank to the hubs. Powder had to be kept dry in kegs wrapped in oilcloth. On days when clouds lifted heat, worked the men hard, and thirst multiplied at noon. Grazing for horses failed near crowded camps, and forage parties stretched the line of march. In contrast, the Sauk Corps moved light when it could and heavy when it must. Baggage slowed them on open prairie. In shaded oak groves, they vanished. By late June, the narrative narrowed to 2 moving shapes on a broad map. The smaller shape kept families north and west of the Rock River line and aimed for the high ground near the Wisconsin. The larger shape tried to push 3 arms forward to close the distance. In between lay villages making hard choices. Some Ho-Chunk leaders urged neutrality and offered the Americans guides to prove it. Some Potawatomi parties acted on local grievances and drew retaliation. Traders weighed credit against risk on every trail. The rising incidents had done their work. A parley had collapsed into a rout. A local raid had expanded fear beyond the Rock River Valley. A probing attack at a small fort had kept nerves on edge across the mining district. Each episode carried more rumor than facts across the countryside. That imbalance is common on frontiers. It pushes commanders to aggressive movement and populations to evacuation. With that push, the pursuit crossed from Illinois into the country that drains toward the Wisconsin. The next phase would be marches described in orders and in terse diary lines from men who counted miles to the river and did not yet know that the river itself would become the last field. The campaign resolved into moving columns and a single northward trail. General Henry Atkinson organized his regulars into a spine to which Illinois and Michigan Territory volunteers could attach. Companies of the 1st United States Infantry and the 6th United States Infantry formed the disciplined corps. Colonel Henry Dodge led mounted men from the mining district who could scout fast and strike small parties that screened the Sauk and Meskwaki movement. Colonel Zachary Taylor brought additional regulars forward as supply allowed. Brigadier leaders mustered short-term volunteers in waves that never aligned in perfect sequence. The river ran high. Roads were more idea than reality. Every order assumed a ford held and a wagon got through. The order of battle in practice was less a neat list than a set of habits. Regulars marched in files with flankers out. Volunteers cantered ahead in clouds of dust and then fell back when brush closed in or when a scout fired from too near. Ho-Chunk scouts led separate parties along deer paths that saved hours and then halted when a trail angled toward a family village that wished no part in the fight. Atkinson's intent was to press but not to scatter his strength. His written direction captured the aim in one line. Pursue the enemy to the river, give them no time to gather provisions, bring the leaders to me. Atkinson, a field order, Sway Rock River Line, July 1832. The march north from Dixon took shape in late June. The land rolled in oak openings and stretched in wet flats where cart ruts filled with brown water. Messengers rode between columns with notes that read as much like weather reports as like combat plans. When the sun drove the damp from the prairie, the dust rose thick and horse nostrils burned. When the clouds broke, the stream swelled, and men cut brush to firm the approaches. Powder kegs rode under tarps. Bread went hard, and then soft again with the air. Forage for horses failed near camps that swelled with new companies and shrank again when enlistments expired. On maps, the arrows looked steady. On the ground, the line of march pulsed like a tired lung. Against this weight, Black Hawk held a rear guard that knew the bends and ridges. The larger band moved with women, children, and elders and carried a scant store of corn for seed and a few packs of meat. Hunters went out at dawn and returned with thin shoulders of deer or with nothing. The fighting men could melt into oak shadow when the sun set low and then slip back to the train before first light. The goal was not to win a battle. It was to keep the families ahead of the pursuers long enough to reach the Mississippi and cross. Skirmishes in the last week of June and the first days of July rarely broke into open fights. A volley from brush on a ridge would halt a volunteer company, and then the shooters were gone. A scout would find a kettle still warm and a half-dug pit for roasting corn, and send word back that the village could not be far. Each scrap of sign drew the columns farther north and west, away from the Rock River towns and into the Wisconsin watershed, where wide bottoms and high terraces shaped the next stand. Wisconsin Heights fixed the moving campaign to a place and a late July date. The Sauk rearguard chose ground above the Wisconsin River, where a terrace fell to marsh and then to bends of slow water. Late afternoon light cut across the grass. The line of American advance thickened as mounted men arrived and regulars closed the distance. What followed was not a grand set piece. It was disciplined bursts of fire from men who had climbed the ridge and settled behind brush and logs, followed by pauses as they listened for movement below. On the American side, officers tried to bring order to overlapping companies and to hold them in a line that did not trip over itself. For hours the sound rose and fell. The sun went down, and the prairie cooled. Casualty counts vary, and are modest compared to the violence at the river weeks later. The effect at Wisconsin Heights was time and space purchased. The rear guard held long enough for the main body to slip away along the marsh edge toward the Black River route. American officers reported a field that could be crossed at dawn, and a trail that promised contact within a day. Men on both sides slept poorly. The smell of spent powder and trampled sedge lay heavy on the ground. After Wisconsin Heights, the logic of the campaign hardened. The Sauk and Meskwaki train moved on a fixed axis toward the Mississippi. Atkinson's combined force could feel the river like a wall ahead. Scouts reported raft poles being cut and bark peeled for lashings. Volunteers whispered that if the band reached the far bank, the chase would fail, and all the risk would have been for nothing. Regular officers circled dates on their small notebooks and calculated marches by hours and fords. Rations thinned. Men boiled coffee in blackened cups and chewed hard bread that tasted of damp wood. Horses nosed bare earth where grass had been grazed to the roots. In the first days of August, the river came into view. The mouth of the Bad Axe offered a crossing if time allowed. Families started rafts. Some men swam the first loads, across with lines in their teeth. Then the steamboat Warrior came up from the south with a small gun, and a crew from Prairie du Chien. Smoke blew in gusts across the deck. Men on the shore raised a white flag. Accounts differ on what words were carried over water and whether the crew heard a request to parley or read a ruse to board. The crew fired a round of canister and then more small arms into the timbered bank and at figures in the shallows. The boat withdrew when powder ran low with plans to return with troops on the morning tide. The next day brought land and water into one action. Atkinson's men closed from the east as the Warrior returned from the south. Shots cut through willow and cottonwood. People jumped for the river. Some reached canoes. Some fell among the reeds. Firing lines on the bank could not always see who was in the water. After the first volleys, men on the American side advanced among the trees and fired again at shadows that moved between trunks. An after-action voice from the boat spoke without flourish and has been copied many times since. We fired into the timber where they lay and into the water where they swam. The work was severe. Allen Vessel Report, near Bad Axe, Mississippi, Swires, August 1832. Casualties at the crossing defy a single number. Contemporary reports from American officers spoke of many dead and of prisoners taken. Later estimates of Sauk and Meskwaki losses run from scores to well over 100, with a large share being women and children who were caught in the last press. American dead were few by comparison, though individual companies recorded men hit in the first rush, through the trees and at the water edge. The scale matters less here than the character. The campaign's last field was a riverbank strewn with rafts and with bodies, not a prairie where two formed lines traded volleys under clear rules. Non-combatants bear the plainest record. Some were taken prisoner and moved under guard by canoe and wagon to Prairie du Chien. Some who crossed in the night before the main fight reached the far bank, only to be taken by Dakota parties allied with the United States. Others lay on the shore in places where reeds still bend in wind. In the days after the crossing burial, details combed the trees and sandbars. Surgeons treated wounds among prisoners with the same tools they used for soldiers. A few children survived and appear later in agency records under new spellings of old names. Rules of engagement had narrowed by then to an imperative to end the fight. That imperative did not spare all who tried to surrender. The white flag moment of the first day remains the sharpest dispute between recollections on the boat and accounts from the shore. Fact versus folklore runs in two lines. Some later frontier tales claimed a great ambush was planned under cover of the flag, and that only the boat's quick actions saved the crew. Surviving vessel notes and native statements point to a confused attempt at parley across wind and steam where words could not carry. The fight that followed was not a trap sprung with guile. It was the collapse of maneuver into killing at the waterline. When the firing ended, the campaign turned into process. Atkinson took stock and sent reports downriver. Prisoners were counted and guarded. Scouts followed trails along the backwaters to be sure no armed party remained. A detachment moved to intercept those who might have reached the far bank. Within days, Black Hawk surrendered to Ho-Chunk intermediaries and was delivered to American officers. The columns that had struggled through mud and heat for weeks now marched in silence behind wagons that did not carry rations, but people. In letters written after the war, some volunteers tried to shape the memory of the last engagement into a clean victory over a dangerous foe. Others wrote with an unease that never left them. One regular officer measured his words and confined them to distances marched and rations issued and prisoners transferred because numbers and nouns felt safer than impressions. A frontier newspaper printed lists of thanks to commanders and to towns that supplied provisions. Another carried a short notice that a child taken at the river had been found alive. The landscape kept its own record. Cut raft poles grayed on the bank. Shallow graves sank and smoothed under rain. By the time the columns turned back toward the lower river, the campaign's strategic markers were complete. Order of battle had mattered in the holding action on the heights. Logistics had mattered more in the last week when speed and endurance decided who reached the bank first. Rules written in ink had bent under the pressure of rumor and fear, and then snapped when smoke and wind erased the sound of voices. The confrontation ended not with flags exchanged in a field, but with a current that carried the last fragments of a village past a gunwale and down toward a fort whose stores had at last caught up with its orders. The turning point lies between the ridge above the Wisconsin and the water at Bad Axe. It is not a single volley. It is a hinge made of time ground and exhaustion. Who, where, and when are exact. Black Hawk, with fewer than 200 fighters guarding a larger train of women, children and elders, reached the Mississippi at the mouth of the Bad Axe on August 1 and August 2, 1832. General Henry Atkinson's combined force closed from the east. The steamboat Warrior moved from the south. The wind ran across the river and pushed smoke and words back toward the shore. Objectives and constraints defined each side. For Black Hawk, the objective was to cross with as many families as possible and to avoid a last stand on the east bank. Constraints were severe. Ammunition was low after the holding action at Wisconsin Heights. Rations were nearly gone. Raft building stole daylight from scouting. The river itself could kill, even when no one fired. For the United States, the objective was to prevent the escape and secure the leaders while shielding settlements from further raids. Constraints were fewer but present. Volunteers were near the end of short enlistments. Horses were worn. Coordination between land columns and the boat relied on imperfect signals and on the simple hope that both would arrive together. The immediate effect once the boat fired on August 1 was loss of initiative for the Sauk and Meskwaki train. A white flag was raised on the bank. Men on the Warrior later wrote, they could not hear clear words across the gusts and believed a ruse was likely. The boat's gun and small arms drove people back into the timber and delayed the crossing. That delay gave Atkinson the hours he needed. On August 2, his columns reached the bank and pressed the camp with musketry as the Warrior returned. The trapped band tried to swim or push rafts into the current, while others fought among the trees to cover them. The initiative had shifted and would not return. An evidence-based counterfactual can be stated in plain terms without romance. If the first exchange between shore and boat on August 1 had resulted in a parley and an immediate surrender of the fighting men, the riverbank on August 2 would likely have seen fewer dead and more prisoners. Yet the structural forces that drove events would have remained. The American columns would still have closed. The state and federal policy to fix the Sauk and Meskwaki west of the Mississippi would have been enforced. The consequence for land titles in northern Illinois and for removals in the upper Mississippi would not have changed in substance even if the casualty list had been shorter. The human cost is the measure that does not fit into orders or returns. Names surface in fragments. Neopope had carried messages to the north months earlier and stood in the last ring of defenders when the families ran for the water. Pashepaho had argued for caution in earlier seasons and lived to see the crossing break. Ho-Chunk intermediaries would soon carry Black Hawk to surrender, but could not stop the shooting at the bank. Some prisoners taken after the fight appear later in agency roles with spellings that smooth older sounds. A few children survived and were recorded in notes that speak of custody and rations rather than of kin. The winter counts that mark the year with a drawing of a boat and lines of fire show how communities kept the memory when paper spoke only of returns and reimbursements. An admission against interest from the American side lives in a volunteer recollection set down years after the river fight. We called it victory, yet there were many women and little ones in the brush that day, and the thought of it has never sat easy with me. Anonymous volunteer, recollection, near Galena country. Post-war, weather and water played their quiet part. The wind that carried smoke back toward the bank robbed the white flag of meaning. The current that pulled swimmers downstream broke rafts made of poles cut in haste. Mud at the margin slowed feet and caught those who tried to run parallel to the shore. These are small natural facts, but they set the field as surely as any general. The turn also pressed terms onto the language of the frontier. From that week on, the campaign could not be told as a series of equal engagements between armed lines. The decisive hours involved a moving village cornered between a river and a closing force. Those who fought on the American side wrote official lines about pursuit accomplished and leaders captured. Those who lived on the other side drew a year mark and counted the people who did not return. This hinge connects back to the structure laid in P2. A disputed paper from 1804 created a legal frame that American officials would enforce once numbers and logistics allowed. Settler pressure after the War of 1812 narrowed the space for seasonal return. The militia system produced sudden mass with thin discipline. When the first contact collapsed at Stillman Creek, fear replaced negotiation. Each of those forces pushed the smaller band toward the river and shaped the decision made at the bank. The turning point is therefore not only bad acts. It is the moment when all previous pressures aligned in a single geography where escape required hours that the boat and the columns removed. When the shooting stopped and the river carried silence down toward Prairie du Chien, the strategic line had crossed a threshold. From that point, the story would move from campaign to custody, from custody to removal, from removal to memory. The final pages of orders would be written in neat hands. The last lines of the winter counts would remain in images. The hinge that turned the war had done its work. The guns fell silent, and the work of custody began. On the river islands near Prairie du Chien, soldiers counted prisoners and gathered the wounded. Officers wrote brief notes that sounded like ledger entries. Numbers first, names if known, rations issued. An escort column formed and moved the captives to the post. General Henry Atkinson filed his formal account within days, a field report from early August 1832 that summarized the pursuit, the fight at the river, and the transfer of prisoners to federal hands. That report, copied in departmental files at the upper Mississippi posts, set the official frame for what followed. Black Hawk and selected leaders were separated for transport. A junior officer escorted them by water to the lower river posts and then overland to Jefferson Barracks. The custody line runs through routine papers rather than a single dramatic scene. Guard returns at Prairie du Chien for August and September show issue of rations to prisoners and the assignment of sentries. Quartermaster notes at Jefferson Barracks for late 1832. Record clothing and blankets for detainees held under Army authority. The language is dry, the meaning is clear. The United States chose detention and display rather than battlefield execution. Trials were not the central instrument. Federal officials used executive discretion. In the spring of 1833, orders sent the principal prisoners east under military supervision. In Washington City, they appeared before the president and before senior officers as living proof of national reach. Newspaper accounts in eastern cities that spring printed sketches of the party and quoted short remarks by officials about mercy and firmness. The autobiography of Black Hawk, dictated later in 1833 to an interpreter and a printer on the upper Mississippi, preserves his own account of the return, the surrender, and the journey under guard. Read alongside Atkinson's dispatch and the vessel report from the steamboat Warrior filed at Prairie du Chien. It gives a two-sided view that scholars still place at the core of the record. Administration on the ground moved in parallel. Illinois and Michigan Territory officials prepared reimbursement claims for militia service and supplies. Governor John Reynolds published a retrospective narrative within a few years, defending the call-up and arguing that decisive action had prevented worse violence. At the posts, agents reviewed annuity schedules and the delivery of goods promised under earlier agreements. Army surgeons compiled brief notes on the wounded, both soldier and prisoner, which sit in post returns without comment on affiliation. The bureaucracy of an expanding republic absorbed the war into columns and totals. Land and resource lines shifted next. In September 1832, negotiators at Fort Armstrong concluded a treaty that ceded a wide strip on the west side of the Mississippi, later known to Americans as the Black Hawk Purchase. The text preserved in the Federal Treaty Series described the cession in bearings from river features and bluffs and reserved a few small tracts for agency use. The practical effect was to open the eastern Iowa Bank to licensed settlement and to push Sauk and Meskwaki communities farther west into narrower spaces along interior rivers. Surveyors entered the new strip within a season. By the mid-1830s, ferries and town plats marked the corridor from Dubuque down to the Des Moines confluence. Resource control followed the lines. Timber leases shifted to United States license holders. The lead district drew more miners and freight. River landings once used for seasonal gardens became steamer stops and later points for rail connections. Agency ledgers show annuity payments delivered at set times to headmen recognized by the government. Traders' account books show debts settled in pelts or in labor under the new conditions. The transformation was not a sudden sweep, but a steady press of paper backed by the memory of a short war. Demography and health moved with the land. Census returns across the 1830s count rising settler populations in counties along the river and record fewer native villages east of it. Agency physician notes speak of fever, respiratory illness, and malnutrition in seasons when rations ran short at newly compressed settlements. Mortality notices appear in scattered lines without names. The data is thin, but the direction is consistent. War did not end with the last volley. It continued as exposure and scarcity. Education policy expanded in the same decade. Mission and federal schools enrolled children from Sauk, Meskwaki, Ho-Chunk, and Potawatomi communities in growing numbers. Agency correspondence in the mid-1830s and early 1840s mentions attendance tallies requests for clothing and disputes over language of instruction. Those letters sit beside supply vouchers and treaty annuity receipts and show how governance after the war reached into daily life. Not every path ran only westward under assignment. Meskwaki families using annuity funds and community pooling began to purchase land in Iowa later in the century, re-establishing a presence outside the standard reservation grid. Tribal histories and state land records document that return by purchase. Ho-Chunk communities forced west and north in repeated waves after 1832 maintained ties to Wisconsin and later secured federal recognition and land there. Potawatomi groups endured removals in the later 1830s along hard routes to the west. The pattern is varied, but one thread is constant. Nations adapted and endured beyond the war's short calendar. Memory took form in image and place. Winter counts from plains communities mark the year with a boat and lines of fire on a river. Ledger drawings in museum collections show riverbanks and figures in water with rifles along a tree line. On the ground, Wisconsin Heights received a memorial in later decades. The bluffs above the Bad Axe carry markers and a state site. Local histories printed in county volumes reused extracts from Atkinson's report from the Warrior Vessel account and from Governor Reynolds' book to anchor their chapters. The native side spoke through narrative and drawing rather than through official minutes. Both streams persist. 5 pieces of record stand out when read together. Atkinson's August 1832 dispatch from the upper Mississippi establishes the federal view of the pursuit and the crossing. The Warrior's brief report printed in frontier papers that month captures the first day's exchange and the claim of misheard words under wind and steam. Governor Reynolds's published account argues the state case for rapid mobilization and frames the war as necessary defense. The 1832 treaty text at Fort Armstrong defines the land change that followed within weeks. The dictated narrative of Black Hawk in 1833 offers the most compact native account of AIM movement and surrender. With those 5, and with Dodge's July letters from the mining district to fill the campaign's middle weeks, the archive provides a spine strong enough to hold the story. Present-day continuance deserves the last word in this part. Thakiwaki, Sauk, and Meskwaki Fox communities live in Iowa, Kansas, and Nebraska with elected governments and programs in language and culture. The Ho-Chunk Nation lives in Wisconsin and Nebraska with land, schools, and health services. Potawatomi nations hold land and citizenship across the Midwest and the Plains. Public history at Wisconsin Heights and at the river bluffs includes signage that names Native nations and not only militia companies. Language classes in tribal centers carry words from elders to children. Commemorations gather each year to walk the ground and to say the names a record once reduced to totals. Law and administration completed what battle began, but communities made continuance out of narrow spaces. The paper trail from 1832 and 1833 is thin and official in tone. The winter count marks are spare. Together, they show how a short war created long lines on maps, and how those lines met lives that did not end at the water. Scholars converge on several durable conclusions. The war rose from a sovereignty dispute anchored in the 1804 St. Louis paper, and from the tightening of settler pressure after the War of 1812. Once militia mobilization scaled in May and June 1832, the imbalance of numbers, logistics, and river control made an American victory likely. The culminating violence at Bad Axe reflected the geometry of a pursuit that fixed a moving village against water and time rather than a set piece clash between equal lines. Consensus also holds that the campaign carried policy consequences beyond its short calendar. Federal and state officers moved quickly from field reports to treaty text to surveys and sales. The Black Hawk Purchase opened the West Bank corridor and accelerated the shift from seasonal return to titled settlement. Administrative practices hardened around annuities, ration schooling, and removal, producing a framework that would shape Midwestern lands and communities through the 1830s and 1840s. Important points remain contested. Casualty counts at the river vary across reports and memoirs, and the proportion of non-combatant deaths cannot be fixed with certainty from surviving documents. The degree of coordinated Potawatomi action with the Sauk Corps is debated, with evidence favoring episodic Allied parties rather than a unified plan. The exchange at the White Flag on August 1 divides vessel recollection and native narrative and will likely remain a disagreement of vantage and sound carried by wind. These disputes do not erase the record. They mark the limits of what the archive can settle. The enduring legacy moves on two tracks. For the United States, the campaign became a lesson in mobilization on a fluid frontier and a precedent for rapid translation of force into title. For Thakiwaki, Sauk, Meskwaki, Fox, Ho-Chunk, and Potawatomi communities, the same weeks became a year mark that fused memory of loss with the work of continuance. Ledger drawings, winter counts, and community commemorations preserved the riverbank as a place of mourning and teaching. Later returns by purchase and the growth of tribal governments and language programs in Iowa, Wisconsin, Kansas, and Nebraska show a long answer to a short war. Read across 2 centuries, the episode warns that paper written without full consent and enforced under rumor and hurry can turn planting grounds into killing ground. It endures in memory because a small band's return for seed and counsel revealed how law force and landscape could reshape a whole frontier. You have traced the road from Stillmans Run to the Bad Axe riverbank. Did history turn because it had to, or because no one truly listened?